the German research institution has gotten interest in this topic, why you had gotten interested in this topic. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vasil. Excellent question. How did it come that we got interested in this topic? So when we were planning this project, we were trying to identify areas where research done by foreigners like us was needed or could be useful. And we realized that given how long the war has already been ongoing, many of the stories related to it had already been told by researchers. And so one of the major questions that would now be needed to answer was how the conflict has shaped Ukrainian society and how will it continue to shape it? What are the effects of this war beyond the contact line in the rest of the country? And veterans are, of course, a very essential part of this as one of the groups the most affected by this war. And they inevitably remind society that the conflict is ongoing, even in places where it may seem very distant. And so we simply realized that it would be crucial for Ukraine and for Ukrainian society to get this reintegration of veterans right. And so that is why we decided to look into reintegration, try to understand what was going on, what the situation was currently like, and why. And we realized that this is an area where in-depth research could really make an important contribution, because also in communicating it to international stakeholders, and in emphasizing that already today, even with the conflict still ongoing, that it's important to invest considerable time and resources in the reintegration process. And so that research was also needed to sort of identify the areas to focus on. And so that is how Theresa and I started this project together with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Kiev. And working with Katerina Malefyeva, we conducted 36 interviews with different stakeholder groups, so veterans, but also government officials, civil society representatives, and international organizations to understand sort of the different sides of this issue, the different aspects of it. And then the Ukrainian Razumkov Center conducted 3 focus groups, one in Western, one in Central, and one in Eastern Ukraine. And yeah, so that's how we looked at those who participated in the ATO, or the JFO as it's now called, on the side of the government-controlled Ukraine. We didn't look whether people we interviewed had a status, or if they are now part of the security forces, or if they stayed in the army. So we tried to incorporate as many as possible. And one thing I'd like to say is that we understand, of course, that reintegration is first and foremost an individual issue, and it's an individual experience. And so research, of course, cannot depict each of these individual experiences, but it also has a very important societal dimension. And this is what we wanted to look at with this project.
Thank you, Julia. It's great that this idea has emerged, and we're so happy that we've managed to support this study. So, talking about reintegration of veterans, what kind of process is that? Why is there a need? What is special in veterans coming home and needing to help to be helped reintegrating? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Vasil. I would take that up and pick it up exactly where Julia left, with making this differentiation between reintegration being an individual process and at the same time a societal process. And generally, we in our work regard veteran reintegration as this fundamental issue of finding a place for the conflict and for the veterans within society. And we assume that there's approximately 400,000 veterans, depending on the definition of the term. And as the war is ongoing, there will be more veterans to come. So it is a process that hundreds of thousands of people are in at the moment. And thus it is important to talk about it again, as we already said, despite the conflict still ongoing. And when we look at that process of reintegration itself, I think we can say that it is this highly personal, individual process for every veteran. And we actually asked all our participants what reintegration means for them. And they all replied differently. One response that we got from an interviewee is that reintegration means coming back to full life. And despite this being very different and individual for everyone, I think it's also important to mention that reintegration, the word itself, can be a bit misleading at times, because especially when we assume that it means that soldiers return to their homes, because many veterans are also IDPs. They are not really reintegrating into the places that they lived at before. And additionally, by far not all veterans generally return to the lives, to the jobs that they had prior to the combat experience. And while being this very individual process, simultaneously it also takes place on a larger societal level. And on both of these, there are lots of challenges that come with it. And on a societal level, I think we found mostly that civilians and veterans struggle to find a mode for talking about the conflict with one another. And there is this clash of extreme experiences, of the urge to talk about these experiences on the one hand, and then at the same time a desire to return to normality for many of the civilians. And I think that's both understandable, but it is a dilemma because there are these two groups within a society that struggle to find a way to interact. And as one of the consequences is that we do see that veterans are confronted with lots of stereotypes, and they often translate into concrete discrimination, for example, at the workplace or against particular groups, LGBT+ veterans, female veterans. And so now this was like the societal level. And in addition to that, I said that it is a very individual process and that it also comes with challenges. And I think generally veterans, that when coming back, they are in this transition from being a soldier to being a veteran. And this is especially difficult because the war is still ongoing and prevents this clear demarcation or boundary. And based on the interviews that we conducted, our impression is that veterans often don't feel they have the space to share or digest their experiences, either within their families or with their friends, and retreat into peer groups where they where they share similar experiences. And this is also because families and friends often don't know how to handle the situation, feel insecure, or of course also have political disagreements.
Дякую, Тереза. Перед тим, як
Thank you, Theresa. Before we ask the next question, let me remind you that all participants in this Zoom session can post their questions in Q&A section in the chat. Use any language you want, and your questions will be voiced to the speakers. And so now that we have a better understanding of what we mean under reintegration, after all the interviews and focus groups, your opinion, and after this profound delving deep into this topic, what, to your opinion, are the main problems, the main challenges that the veterans face after they try and return from the war to peace or whatever the line is? And what happens in this process? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. So I would say that first of all, we do clearly understand that Ukraine is fighting on many fronts. There is an ongoing war, as we said already. There are reform processes. There are anti-corruption efforts. And so some of what doesn't work for veterans has much more to do with these processes than with veteran affairs themselves. But we also find that while there are lots of improvements on the way, the current situation is still insufficient for veterans. One problem being the status itself is often difficult to get. And there has been some great work going on, for example, by NGOs such as Ludo 100 with regards to the laws regulating the status, but we can see that lots of veterans still struggle to even access the benefits. And in addition to that, there is definitely, or it is generally a confusing system. So what ministry is responsible for what? And I mean, it took us a long time for us to understand it from the outside, but many veterans also reflected that it was difficult for them as well. For example, is it sensible to apply for each individual benefit with a different entity, as it is the case at the moment? Or are there ways to streamline the process? And I think in addition to these two areas, one of the struggles we observed as well was that there are different areas of reintegration and benefits that face different problems, for example, in the field of employment, housing. And we found that the psychosocial and the health support system are especially lacking at the moment. And again, there are lots of initiatives we came across regarding psychosocial support. One great example, for example, is Lifeline Ukraine, which is a suicide hotline that is very successful. But the initiatives are quite patchy, and the default at the moment is that you would spend 2 weeks in a state sanatorium, which does not adequately respond to the support many need. And more broadly, the health support is a difficult area because many veterans face some sort of health issue after their combat experiences, and they just don't receive the specific support that they need because there's a general lack of resources, not only for the treatments of veterans. And finally, the health system, and not only that one, has this particularly strong gender dimension to the challenges that come with it. For example, men speak up less often about mental health problems. Female veterans report that they have experienced reproductive problems or severe back pain. So there is this whole dimension of very specific and sensitive approaches that are necessary. And in addition, we can observe that there is a lack of provision for veterans in rural areas. There are already some mobile teams, for example, by the Veteran Hub, and they operate successfully, but again, there is no full coverage. And generally, I think I've already mentioned some great examples of how the civil society is very involved and often very localized in their engagement. But again, also this involvement is very fragmented, and there are many veteran organizations where it is sometimes hard to distinguish which ones are active, which ones can be trusted. And maybe my last point to the question is that in connection to this, there is an unclear situation that also sometimes impedes international assistance. So there is some international involvement, but it is a complex issue, and so we do also see some, definitely some hesitancy on the side of international stakeholders. Thank you.
Дякую, Тереза.
Thank you, Theresa. In chat, I would like to remind everyone again that there is simultaneous interpreting available. You can choose whichever language you want. All you need to do is select on the dashboard. There's a pictogram that looks like an Earth globe. So choose whichever language you'd like, either English, Ukrainian. Also, before we proceed to the next speaker after this exciting presentation, I'd like to ask one more question. Of course, in the study, it says that reintegration of veterans has to be perceived as the holistic task for the whole society. And it's true. But at the same time, we understand that the state as a manager, has to be the coordinational force or the leading force in this effort. What are the state agencies lack? What do they not have to be able to resolve the reintegration scope of issues based on your research? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vasil. Yes, I think the main problem is exactly that the state currently doesn't fulfill its coordinating function, or at least not as well as it could or as it should. So technically, the Ministry of Veteran Affairs is supposed to coordinate veteran policy, but the ministry doesn't have the capacity, finance, or institutional standing to fulfill this task. At least that is what we found in our research, which really limits its cooperation also with other ministries. So, I mean, the Ministry of Veteran Affairs is quite young. Its leadership has changed, I think, 4 times by now, and it's just I think it's just still in the process of sort of establishing itself, which impedes that it is able to fulfill its coordinating function. And so it's also another factor is that the Ministry of Veteran Affairs is a little bit, it's kind of sandwiched between the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. These are both 2 very powerful ministries. And theoretically, the Ministry of Veteran Affairs would need to coordinate veteran policy with them, but it doesn't have the standing to do so. And so, for instance, the Ministry of Defense, at least in our research, it was until the end unclear whether it actually has a program that prepares soldiers for their potential and future reintegration. And this is, of course, would be a very, very important step because as we said, the conflict is ongoing and more soldiers will become veterans eventually. And it would just be very crucial to prepare them for their reintegration already during their service. And so we understand that the Ministry of Defense says we have an ongoing conflict and we need to focus on that. But it also needs to focus, that can't be an excuse to not sort of do this preparation for soldiers who will then become veterans. And in general, interministerial cooperation, it might work in an ad hoc way, but it's not really institutionalized. So because that would require it to be there to be political will from the top. And I mean, we understand institutional cooperation is always difficult in every country, but it's particularly crucial here because veteran affairs are so intersecting. And so it would actually be really important that ministerial actors do coordinate. And it's a bit of a similar situation with the regions where the Ministry of Veteran Affairs doesn't necessarily have the reach into all of the regions, and it's not always even clear. People don't always necessarily know that the Ministry of Veteran Affairs even exists. And so that's just a bad, setup if you want to sort of standardize a certain level of care, if you want. And as a result, what we found is that veterans get caught in this bureaucracy. And this is, of course, a money and a capacity question, but it's also a question of organization and cooperation and thus political will. And a second aspect that I'd like to point out is that there's not enough data on veterans. And so one ministry official actually said to us, we don't actually know our clients. And so there's not really an official statistic that says even how many exact veterans there are. We don't know where they are. We don't know how many of them have a job and all of these issues. And so this, of course, makes policymaking extremely hard if you don't know who you're targeting. And so Theresa already mentioned, but especially dramatic. This is especially dramatic regarding veterans that live in rural areas that are often not included. And when we speak about veterans, and in general, I think there's a risk that that there are dominant voices among veterans that will be heard, but the voices of the others and of the majority get drowned out. And one other reason why some data is lacking is also that, of course, veteran affairs is a very complex and societally and politically sensitive topic in many ways. And for instance, we were told that some ministries don't collect suicide statistics because, they don't want families to stop receiving benefits. And also, out of a feeling of not wanting to be sort of unfair to veterans, I guess, or to not increase stigma. And this is, of course, very understandable. But again, it doesn't help the policy, because if there are these knowledge gaps, then how can you make a better policy? So these are just two of the things that we found that might be lacking currently.
Чудово, дякую. Ми
Thank you.
обов'язково ще
Yes, we will, of course, return to the in-depth discussion to these issues. Just reminding that the study is published. In the general chat, I posted a link where it's available in Ukrainian and in electronic form. If you want to get it in paper, in hard copy, in Ukrainian, that is also possible. I will later post in the chat the link where you are welcome to write to get a copy, a hard copy in Ukrainian for free from Konrad Stiftung, my Ukrainian post. So going from the general level to the field studies, the field work level, reintegration, fighting for veterans' rights. So my question is to Ivona. I have seen the page Veteran Hub. I've read some of the material from the studies. And of course, Veteran Hub study is a powerful idea, and it has lots of future, and the study results prove that. My question: how often? Well, how popular Veteran Hub is at all? How many people regularly come to you with their problems, with reintegration, with getting back to a peaceful life? What are the problems that they come with the most? Yeah, thank you. Great question. Thank you, Theresa and Julia, for a wonderful study. We will use your prism, your look at the information. So the Veteran Hub started off as the idea of safe space, secure space, not only for veterans themselves, but also for people who do the studies. Because in the study, it says in the beginning, when there was no sustainability, there was no strategic view on the veterans' affairs, and we founded the organization that provided basic space where you can get together, and got a group of experts together that provided these services. We had stable funding, and it continues to be there in Kyiv, in our official partners, Victor and Lena Pinchuk Foundations and Pobratimy Foundation, who work so that the organization is accessible. But together we've achieved in these 3 years 3 goals. We are a constantly working service. Every day we have a working day. There's no day that the veteran doesn't come to us. So based on international studies, international best practices of longitude help and support veterans to not just the moment of returning to society, there I was and now I am, but reintegration that we do in clusters, taking care of themselves in terms of health, their mental, their physical health, reinventing themselves as members of society, finding their new calling, their new role, their new passion in life. And thirdly, planning, being able to plan long term. We talk about 3 to 5 years, more sustainable life, more productive, more fruitful life. So we are also, thanks to IREX, we opened in 2 more regions, and we also see that they have customer base. And thanks to quarantine, we moved largely to online, which was not available before 2020. And now we have addresses from each region of Ukraine quite constantly. Vinnytsia, Kyiv are most frequent, regionally less, but now we have 600 addresses monthly. That's a minimal monthly number of addresses that we receive in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Ivona, for your contribution. And could you please tell me, so do you think that the work of a Veteran Hub is actually a task of the civic society of the sponsors, or is this a state task? Well, in my opinion, and our organization believes that this is a natural process. So no matter whether the state or the civil society has these services, so the state and the civic society can influence the process and its potentially good outcome. So that it happens quick enough. So I believe this is everyone's task, how to deal with the veterans after they come back. And it is really important to share this culture, not only on the level of the state or on the level of the civil society. So it is all about, I don't know, about the doctors who assist veterans, or on the level of the employers who need to understand specific features of the veterans, because there are many of them and they are going to continue working. It is about the teachers in universities and so on and so forth. Veteran Hub undertakes the task which the state is not able to fulfill, providing day-to-day stable, sustainable services to veterans. Right now, the state is not capable of providing these services, and in my opinion, that the state is supposed to develop the general policies, which includes all the state institutions and all of the spheres of the society, so that the veterans are sufficiently supported with all assets that there are in place. But in terms of the services, I believe that the civic center has potential in these particular terms. Well, great. Thank you very much, Ivona. Well, I have my next question to Viktor Pilipenko, who is a veteran himself, to a man who experienced the combat life and the comeback to a peaceful life. If I may, I would like to ask you, what problems did you experience after your coming back home? And maybe your brothers in arms, what problems did they face? What are the most frequent problems where they needed help? Thank you very much for your question. First of all, I would like to thank Julia and Theresa for your very interesting speeches and for your interest in the problems of the veterans in Ukraine. We really appreciate it. And I would also like to thank Veteran Hub for your assistance. And me personally, I am getting assisted by Veteran Hub. Specifically, I'm getting psychological assistance, and my unity, my association, the Veteran Association, is also working with Veteran Hub. This institution is really inclusive. But back to your question. First and foremost, I would like to say that I was a volunteer. I took part in the volunteer battalion, and I got mobilized in 2016. And my brothers in arms took a part in different campaigns in Debaltsevo, in Ilovaisk. I personally took part in Shirokin's campaign, and this was during a long period of time. And my peers, they were traumatized psychologically a lot. And the reintegration was a hard thing to do. And the reintegration is still ongoing, even though you can imagine that it's been a long time since we came back. It was really hard to re-socialize with the civic population, with the civilians. I would like to point out that the civilians in Ukraine is not ready to be faced with veterans and their problems. For example, in Israel, they have programs focused on the civilians so that they get ready and prepared to work, to interact with the veterans. In Ukraine, instead, even the closest relatives, for example, the parents, they don't know how they shall behave. I don't know, maybe parents or wives or partners, they don't know how to react on certain circumstances or certain features of the veterans' experiences. the psychological tension is a big challenge. Then the problems of reintegration in the society, professional reintegration. Looking for a job, even if you have certain qualification, it is not easy to come back to professional life. It is also a frequent situation when they get rejected by the employers, and the employers see the veterans as somebody risky, that this post-traumatic disorder that the veterans possibly have can affect the way they fulfill their obligations. And another risk is that the state provides protection for the veterans' rights. And the employers are afraid of that because it is maybe difficult and complicated to fire a veteran if he or she needs to be fired. And as for my battalion or other volunteer battalions, the boys, they are really patriotic. They have powerful patriotic feelings. And after coming back from war, they frequently wanted to protect their state, to go on protecting it. But unfortunately, the state did not provide them with further development perspectives within the armed forces. It was hard enough to be promoted to officer positions. It was really difficult to get trained and be promoted in their career within the armed forces. So they decided to try their luck in some corps or political projects who were ready to accept them. And then the peers of mine, they had some problems, including problems with the law. They were instrumentalized in somebody's interests, and they were not aware that this is happening to them. This is also a problem. If the state would undertake more responsibility for that, the veterans would be provided with certain positions. I don't know, for example, in like if we see the experience of the USA after the Vietnam War, the soldiers were reintegrated through more than 100 rehabilitation centers, and they were provided jobs at schools where they taught young men something like military education or something. They're giving some lump sum to start their own business, and so on. In Ukraine, well, I liked what Theresa said, in patches. So we have a patch carpet. So everything is rather provided by the civil society. When we look at the veteran support program or training programs for veterans in requalification or psychological assistance, they are in place, but finding these programs is not an easy thing to do. Veterans need to be searching for these things, and again, it is not easy. It would be easier if the state would introduce a system so that people in rural areas could have access to these programs. As for me, I am residing at a rural area near Kiev, and here I don't, as a veteran, I don't have too big opportunities. In some practical situation, I don't know who I shall address. The only thing is that Veteran Hub is right now accessible online, which is a good thing. Another point I would like to make, right now I am ahead of the LGBT Veterans Association. So we have self-united. Right now, there are more than 100 people in our association, and we have certain problems which have to do with the state unrecognizing us as legal persons. I mean, I mean families, LGBT military servicemen families. We also took part in war and war action. We were risking our lives and health, and we were losing our lives and health. But our families are not families officially. The state is not recognizing them as families. And this is a big problem for the members of the LGBT soldiers' families and for their children. It's the same when the partner comes back from war with some disability. The members of their families are not recognized by the state, and they don't have access to social support, which the heterosexual families have. And this is also a crucial problem we need to address. And moreover, the members of the LGBT families don't have access to the state social benefits. As for the heterosexual family, they have 50% discounts for certain fees. We don't have it. Or healthcare, for example, getting assisted at military hospitals, so the members of our families cannot get access to it, and burial. So LGBT military families don't have access to these services. So there is a range, a list of these problems which we would like to address, and which is why we have gotten united. And right now, we would like to introduce an instrument. This is namely the civil partnerships for LGBT people. So we would like to negotiate it with the Ministry of Veterans, but we can feel that the civil council at the Ministry of Veterans, so there are some members of it which, or who would be most probably opposing us. So we will try to face this issue and do our best. Excuse me for taking too long, but I was happy to be able to tell you about my experience. Thank you very much. As we can see, well, the general national issues having to do with the veteran are still unaddressed. Well, I see all the questions in the chat, so we have many questions in the chat, and I will ask them. Well, partially the question by Maria Kolokova. Well, this is a question to Mr. Viktor Pilipenko, but maybe the both research authors could also answer it. So this is a question about the successful cases, about the success stories. So what can you call a success story of a veterans reintegration? So what story could you tell us if you were to answer a question about a success story? Well, what I can say, well, a successful reintegration was possible for the guys having a trendy profession. For example, IT guys. So they didn't have a hard time reinventing themselves after coming back. Or guys who had stable life and employment and supporting families. So these are people of 40 plus. When they came back, they just went on living. But as for young men, they really have hard time. Well, I served in a grenade brigade, and I had a peer. I will not tell you how he was called, and he was really young. He was 20 something. When he returned back from war, war had really vast impact on his psyche, and he started drug abuse, and this was really a doom for him. He had nowhere to go. He didn't have any stable employment. And this is not a single case. There are many cases like that. Another peer of mine from my battalion, he he was injured and he could not find himself in a professional life. So he started working as a regular worker, and he had really hard physical work, and he was bleeding because of the hard work he was performing. He would stay at a hostel because he moved to Kiev from the occupied territory. He didn't have a place to live, so he earned money by physical work. Having his trauma, he had to pay for the hostel, he had to work hard, and he's still living this way, and this is not the best and the easiest lifestyle, I believe. And there are many stories like that. I had my own problems too when I came back. For example, at my working place, I had a job where my colleagues were not really interested in the war. They ignored the war issues, or they were openly against the Ukrainian military servicemen. And knowing about my military experience, they were my latent foes, my latent enemies. And I had hard time working in this collective, in this team, but I had to do that because I didn't have other choice. And this creates certain number of problems for the veterans. Yes, this is a difficult process, I believe. As the research reads, this is a complicated social task which requires different contributions. Ivona, would you like to add something? Yes, I would like to add on these issues. So the question of Maria is really interesting. So let me come back to what Julia and Theresa said about the gradual development of the ministries and the lack of a system of veterans assistance. So right now, we don't understand what support the state shall provide. The assessment system of the qualities of this service is also a problem because we don't have a unified register, a unified database of the veterans. As for our experience, we are right now assessing the welfare state that has been developed both in the USA and in the Canada. So this is a normal assessment for the NATO states. So the well-being, the welfare, this is a theory stating that the human being needs to fulfill several needs to be happy. So these are the health needs, this is the cultural needs, and others. So by satisfying one need, we are satisfying other needs. So if you would be interested in learning more about the system, I can tell you the exact name. This is the welfare inventory. You can Google it and learn more about it. So we are very much using this system in our work to assess the quality of the services. And objectively, I can say I have difficulties to say whether our impact on a concrete veteran was positive or negative. So we can not assess on the long term whether this was positive or negative in terms of our impact. Thank you very much. And Julia, would you like to add something as to the question, what can be deemed a successful reintegration of veterans?
Well, Well, so we came across, we interviewed different people also at, at different stages of their reintegration process. And I must say that we were also very impressed with all the different initiatives that there were, lots of peer-to-peer support that is happening. So that was really great to see. I think the most famous example that anyone who lives in Kiev will know is the Veterano Pizza, the pizza chain that was invented and set up by veterans. And we also interviewed one of their founders, and it was it's a really impressive project, and also I can really recommend the pizza. It's very good, but it's just great to see how all the difficulties that veterans face that we've also discussed, how they are how people arrive at translating them into something new, into something so productive, and they also emphasize how important it was for them to show that veterans can deliver a good quality product, and I think that's quite impressive, and I think that is definitely a success story.
Чудово, так, success stories також.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, success story is something we definitely need, especially when we speak a lot about problems. But the success stories, this is something we really want to have. Well, another important question, well, two questions, which are interconnected. The representative of the British Embassy asked a question in the chat, whether are there any evidence whether the veterans can potentially be driver for instability, and how does this manifest itself? As for me, another issue that is interconnected with that, what are the risks of political instrumentalization of a veteran? So this is a question I would like to address everyone. Maybe Julia, you have the floor to answer this question in the first place.
Yes, so in the study, we have a whole section on sort of political obstacles to reintegration. And I think there are clear risks that also need to be addressed. But if we talk about whether veterans are a driver of instability, I think the first thing that's important to point out is that they are veterans are a very diverse group, a group as diverse as society. And so I think that's also just very important to keep in mind when speaking about that. But yes, so we interviewed, when we talk about political instability, I think there are different aspects to this question. And the first one is the influence of far-right extremism in the veteran scene or among veterans. This is a topic that Western media very much likes to address. And so for us, it was first of all important to sort of see beyond that. But we also interviewed two groups that I think we can all agree on do not fall into the democratic spectrum anymore. And when I think it's very difficult to say if they pose a threat to instability. I think that their influence is just too limited. I think they pose a threat to reintegration in the sense that they are abroad, but also in Ukraine. Their voice is heard very loudly, and because of that, the voices of other veterans, of the majority of veterans that are in the democratic spectrum, these voices are then no longer heard. And so I think that's where the main problem is that we have with this sort of aspect of reintegration. Is just that you end up hearing only the voices of only the radical voices, but no longer the voices of the majority of veterans. As for their political use, I mean, many veterans told us that they all sorts of political parties were interested in cooperating with them, for political campaigns, for instance. But we also heard of economic exploitation. We heard of veterans who, were recruited for private oligarchic armies. And I think these are all things that show just how important reintegration is and how important it is that it is done well. Because if a veteran comes back to to full life, as we said in the beginning, then there's also no incentive to, to be recruited for a private army. But if veterans lack other opportunities, then this can be an attractive proposition. And so I think that's why it's so important that we focus on getting the reintegration part right.
Так, насправді це
Yes, fair enough. Well, this is a very important question. Moreover, in the West, there are many dialogues and discussions about that, and maybe unproportionally many discussions around that. But as for Ukrainian context, we cannot afford avoiding this topic. We need to know about the trends and about the scale of these trends and how they can influence the society. Ivona, Victor, can you see any negative potential in marginalization or radicalization of the veterans and their instrumentalization of other actors? Thank you very much. Well, for sure, there is a problem like that. As we can see, the Ukrainian society does not support right-wing radicalism in Ukraine, and this can be seen very clearly when we see the result of the parliamentary elections. Even being united, the right radical parties were not able to come to parliament, enter the parliament. So this is an evidence that the population does not support it. But at the same time, we can see diverse groups which present themselves as right radical parties, and they absorb veterans. We can name a whole range of these groups, but we will not do that now. I believe that everyone knows which groups I mean exactly. And then these organizations use veterans to pursue their political, economical goals. We can see these groups during raid attacks, seizures. We can see them involved in very dubious matters. We can also observe them being involved in security issues, and we can see them also in the political arena. Out of experience, I can tell you that one of my peers was invited in one of these corps, and he had to serve next to people without any military experience, but they were wearing the same uniform. And then the structure told everyone this structure was entirely a veteran structure, and it fulfilled then certain weird actions, taking part in some certain actions. So this is the trend that we observe. This is the first thing I would like to point out. Next thing is the involvement of the right radical structure at the work of the Council of Veterans.
So ideological choice for any of the veterans is a personal choice. Nobody imposes an ideology on anyone, but in order to get into that council, the group that organized it, they built their campaign, and they were counter-imposing themselves to groups who promoted legalization and decriminalization of medical marijuana for the PTSD patients and veterans. And so they were actively against that, and they had become part of the civil council at the Ministry of Veterans. And unfortunately, there's no tool in the establishing text to remove those people for non-ethical behavior, because what they did was open discrimination of other veterans. Unfortunately, in the statute, in the founding documents, this tool is not written, this recourse is not written. Although that lady veteran who represented the patients who promote medical marijuana, she got into the council, but from our union, nobody even got into. So I just wanted to tell you this as one of the stories. Thank you, Ivona. So moving a little bit away from the veteran communities, we don't work with communities, we don't support them, not because we believe it's a less worthy goal, but because we have a different goal. We have to be open for all of the veterans with any life story after war. The only criteria to get the veteran hub and getting services from us is the fact of being veteran. But we noticed that for many veterans, a political action of any flank too early after they return from war can be damaging because of their personal experience, because of their emotions, and the tug of war between political forces can have very negative effect on their life. We talk about suicide, depressive states, different complex experiences that people don't know what to do. They don't know about the services, that services can be provided, but political groups just offer them some encouragement, some marketing for them to get to their side, to express their opinions, and especially if the message is like, you are responsible for what's happening in the country, you have to create the order in the country, in any political party. And that results in a negative consequences for individual veterans, the way they try to rebuild their lives. So in our work, we try to help veterans rebuild the resilience and critical thinking to take an informed decision, because each one is free to choose ideology, but you have to be able to take time to understand what kind of ideology you adhere to. Thank you. Yeah, that's something that we looked into the study, how impactful is that. And also in Germany, this issue is raised quite a lot.
The number of 400,000 was told to us by the Ministry of Veteran Affairs. The problem in assessing their number is that the Ministry of Veteran Affairs knows how many statuses were given out, but it doesn't know how. That doesn't mean that it knows how many veterans there are. So I'm sure that Ivona and Victor would also have something to say on this, but it's just it's a contentious issue also, who is counted as a veteran, and because especially because of the many volunteer fighters that joined in 2014, not all of them were formally registered with any sort of unit with the Ministry of Defense or with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and so that's why they don't formally have the right to get a status. Now there was a law in 2019 that was passed that makes it possible for them to get the status, but not all of them have it. But some of the people who have the status actually weren't veterans. So that's why it's just a bit of a complicated situation, and that's why there is no fixed number where we can say, okay, we know for sure that this is the number of veterans. And then regarding the stakeholder coordination of international actors, I am sure that Ivona also has something to say on this, but as far as we could tell, it wasn't super advanced. So apparently recently there has been an initiative also coming from the Ministry of Veteran Affairs to get people to sit at one table and to discuss sort of the issues that would need to be addressed and who would do what, kind of. But as far as we could tell, there wasn't much coordination going on, and that is also one of the recommendations that we had, because ideally different donors would cover sort of different aspects of reintegration, but it seems that there's a tendency for all to sort of focus on similar things. And so that's definitely something that can be improved upon.
Thank you. Ivona, if you would like to add to this. Sure. Regarding the database and numbers and figures. So initially it was not formed, and Yulia is right, because of the distorted document stream, chaotic document coordination, and then they wound up in different agencies. Now you have to get them back together, and the Ministry of Veterans has to do something. They have to have technical equipment for that, and the project is there already that develops this technical equipment, and it's been announced that this database of veterans has to be there to simplify the work with data, because unless we know who and how many veterans are there, it's very difficult to come up with a state policy. But this general state policy is important to coordinate international community as well. So these are parallel processes that have to happen at the same time, but until now, there has been no state approach. What encompasses the veterans topic, what kind of services we want to achieve, what kind of things we want to help them achieve. So this kind of state strategy, so no matter when, and it's going to be developed, the coordination of Ukrainian civil sector, international actors to support the sector will be much simpler. We also have heard about the initiative of the Ministry of Veteran Affairs to get international companies together, international organizations together, give them some kind of, but it's a very early on initiative because of the lack of the general state policy that would provide a general vision to all the stakeholders, where we're moving, what for, and what kind of things we need to do to support veterans consequently. So yeah, there's no program with clear timeline and goals. That's what's been said in the program. This is how we move toward recommendation and what is worth to do to improve reintegration process. But also before that, there's one more question in the chat. I address it to our veteran present here. How a soldier becomes a veteran? Is that a soldier who decides to stop participating in the military action, or is there some time that passes after you get demobilized? So how is this process organized? How does it look like? If a person not from Ukraine doesn't know specifics in Ukraine, can you explain? So the status of veteran, you get it after you demobilize. So a veteran is when you went through active military service. I don't know any other clear definition. I don't think there is such a definition. In Ukraine, unfortunately, anyone who is demobilized had active military service in the battle or has a status of participants in the battle or have served in the zone of at ATO or joint force operation. Back in the years 14 and 15, the voluntary battalions were not yet integrated in the ministry, and the process was very difficult because there was no term after which you would be considered a veteran. Yes, in the voluntary battalions, we had these problems with the status of active military service. We're now supporting a family of a fallen warrior who's still not recognized by his military unit that he indeed served in that unit. There's still this legal battle to allow his widow to get her and their children to get the benefits. And also there is a problem of false veterans. Like the person didn't, we don't know where that person was, and suddenly they carry a document that says they're a veteran. So these are some of the problems, the legal problems that we get on the way. There was also a question on mobilization. There were 6 waves of conscriptions where people were conscripted to serve a year or more and then demobilized by the Ministry of Defense or a Ministry of Internal. And after that, they got the status of veteran. There are also the military who were in the active military service or in rotation. So depending on that, they can be both veterans and active service people because it's their job. Okay, Yulia, please.
Yes, thank you. Just I think there was another part of this question, sort of how veterans are seen in Ukrainian society and how this reflects their perception of the war. And so as far as I know, there is not a comprehensive data out there on how civilians or how Ukrainian society views veterans. There is data on how attitudes towards veterans, how it's developing or how it's evolving in the government-controlled parts of Donbas. I think UNDP is in charge of this data. But as far as I know, there's no comprehensive data on this. Whether this reflects their perception of the war, I think that's also a very difficult question. It's also a bit of a political question. Some of the people that we spoke to said that they felt like the people who discriminated against veterans were people who had sort of political issues with the course of contemporary Ukraine, with Ukraine's independence. The impression that we had from our conclusion from our research was that much more than political preference, this reflected an uncertainness or an inability to know how to address a veteran, to not be able to share their experience and to just simply not know how to talk to them, rather than a political statement. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe Victor, you would want to say something on that as well. But so this was the result that what we found in our interviews.
Дозвольте доповнити. Здається, Юлія згадала.
And Julia, you mentioned me, yes? You then, and then Ivona. So today I've already mentioned that the civil population, you have to work with civilians to learn how to perceive the veterans' problems. And it's a very important thing for society as such, because society becomes more empathical through that. Having their own identity, my own identity as queer community, the perception of LGBT community is also about empathy, a heightened empathy from society towards veterans. When people would know what PTSD is, what concussion is, so less ignorance, how to properly talk to a person that you know may have a trauma, how to respect their identity. So knowing these ways, that will improve the life in Ukraine. So ignorance is creating the risks and tensions. Lack of knowledge that creates tensions and conflicts in relations between the society, between the civilians and the veterans community. So our community conducted a training in the veteran hub. There was a psychologist who works with our community. She provided a training how to work with civilians for them to understand more what kind of problems the veterans community faces. That was very interesting. There was a lot of feedback on that. There's a huge request and demand on this kind of information. Thank you. Ivona, please. Yeah, I wanted to add that right until now, there hadn't been any study like this that would discuss comprehensively the problems of veterans, comparison between civilian community and veterans. The IRIX announced just yesterday during the Ukrainian Norway conference, they said that the study is already ready to be published. Last February, they presented focus group results in the American House. That information is public access already. The study itself has not yet been published. We're expecting its results because having the data, having some statistical data and sample, you can talk about relations between civilian population and the veterans. But what we know from our work, the situation with veterans is improving, not in the sense that people are getting more accommodated. They're getting used to that. There's this, but there's also more tolerance to perceiving the needs of the veterans. My subjective opinion is that it's an evolution, because the critical mass of veterans is there. 500,000 people, every one in the 100 people in Ukraine has been engaged in this war. So it's a huge concentration of people that doesn't allow us to forget about the experience and to neglect it. One more question from the chat. So question to everybody. The reintegrating women veterans, what are the peculiarities of this topic in Ukraine? Who starts? Maybe you start. Okay, let's do that. So we see the specifics in our activity in terms of availability of services for health during the active service, because unfortunately the infrastructure of the MOD, Ministry of Internal Affairs, was less adapted to veteran women. And during their service, they have less access to physical health, to profile doctors who would help them. And after leaving the service, not many doctors know the impact of battle traumas on women's organisms and traumatization that it leads to. Women who have this experience, it's difficult for them to get qualified help. On the other hand, we see that sometimes there is a demand in working women's veterans groups. There's a minority of them, and to organize the group work for women outside of men, it's difficult because in some regions they are not so numerous. So those are the main challenges that we've seen. Of course, private therapies provide some additional things, but that's a secret of therapy, and we don't disclose that. But the access to services in organization, we try and keep it as open as possible for all veterans, regardless of individual characteristics, so that anyone can get qualified help. And we cannot provide medical services. We cannot have impact that unfairness towards veterans right now that there is in society. So for me, I would add that basically equal rights in the armed forces was institutionalized quite recently. There are still many challenges that we get in perception of women in the military service. So sometimes there's discrimination. Some of the members of our community, overt bisexuals and lesbians, they were discriminated against from the military service people because of the gender, because of their orientation. But there are some progress. There's some progress. There's less discrimination. It's becoming less. Talking about women's veterans community, it's very united. I'm not speaking for it because they will speak for themselves. I have only very superficial knowledge, so I won't comment on that. Julia, maybe you have some comments during the work on this survey? Over to you.
Yes, the topic came up several times, and we also interviewed several women veterans. And well, one thing that we found that I thought was interesting was, or not interesting, but that was making reintegration more difficult for women was that since a lot of it is so self-organized, it's not always super easy for women to participate in veteran associations for men that exist, even if they want to. And sometimes this has just very practical reasons. So there might not be a space for childcare. There may not be someone to take care of their children while they take part in meetings at the veteran associations, or even just very basic, there may just not be any facilities, any toilets, anything for women. So these are just some very practical things that hamper the possibility for women to get as involved or to get involved in the same associations as their male counterparts. And regarding mental health, one very interesting finding that struck me was that women were sometimes expected to somehow be able to better deal with mental health challenges or with trauma resulting from their combat experience than men, because somehow the expectation is that women are more emotional or more in touch with their emotions, and so that's why they would be more able to speak about their experiences. And so this I also found quite sad, that these the expectation is that women somehow are better able to deal with this just on their own than men. No.
Thank you, Julia. So, conscious of the time, let me ask a general question to everyone. What are the things to do? What are the steps to make to improve reintegration? Maybe the steps that the state has to do, civil society or other actors who would achieve the most positive effect on reintegration of veterans in Ukraine and help both veterans and Ukrainian society. Julia, please, you start on this.
Thank you. So we have, I think, 8 to 10 pages of recommendations at the end of the report. So I would encourage you to look at the report if you haven't yet. Some things that I would like to highlight here, I guess the most important finding for us, or the most important recommendation for us, would be to pay more attention to the societal level and move stronger towards community reintegration. So not just so much as veteran reintegration being about providing for veterans the necessary benefits, but about fostering their integration into a community. And I mean, even if the state does everything perfectly right, this is not something that the state by itself can do. So it needs to happen at the community level, and so that's why it's important that literally all of society engage in this effort for it to work. And then regarding government, of course, the primary recommendation would be to better coordinate, to define and implement common standards for service provision, and to have more political will for interministerial cooperation as well. And we actually suggest to implement a comprehensive program on veteran reintegration. So to have a set goal and a set time frame, and then to implement this as a project, because the goal cannot be that for a lifetime veterans can all apply for these different benefits, and if they're lucky then they get them. So that's not the goal. neither of the veterans that we spoke to nor of the government. And so it would be important to make a concerted effort that is also that has an ending in mind for it to work. And then we also have a lot of recommendations for international actors. The most important one that for us was that even though there are considerable efforts happening, especially by the US and by IREX, but also by IOM, EU, and NATO. But these are all, as we said, these are very sort of patchy or fragmented. And so it would be very important to make them more concerted, and also for international actors to realize that even though the conflict is still ongoing, it's worth to, or they need to focus on reintegration already now, also in its own right, basically. So yeah, for everything else, please read the report.
Дякую, Юлія, дякую за це.
Thank you, Yulia. Of course, in a presentation as short as this, we try to encompass all the parts of the study, which is impossible because it's a very large scale. I again post the link to Ukrainian English version of the study so that you can read in electronic form. Ivona, Victor, please, your main recommendations or what you think should be done to improve the reintegration process. And maybe reiterate that there should be a consolidated policy and vision. If it's 2 years ago, it was not established, it was not something established, we were dreaming only to get the veterans issues as an area in the country, but we need to develop our shared standards. We develop them, but it's important so these standards should be accessible for all veterans everywhere in Ukraine. Like for instance, licensing of psychologists. I understand that it's a question for the whole of Ukraine, but still the veterans who don't have the opportunity to get the service by some unified standards, they get bad quality service and they cannot protect themselves from a bad service or the damage that can be dealt with this. So we do a standardization in this area, and what kind of rules that this area has to work towards veterans and what it has to achieve in their life. Because I can agree with Julia, currently there are no realistic goals. They are very romantic. They are somewhat romantic on the state of on the level of state, supporting all veterans by all preferences, by all services. But we don't talk about all things. We don't talk about all veterans. There's a conflict of we have to be more specific, and that's the way to move forward with all the other players. Thank you for this survey. Thank you for the study. Thank you. So one more thing to add, it would be great if there would be more systemic work. So, and that would be facilitated from the state. It would be great enough to that. I would like to stress that not so much the preferences, the payments are important, that it's important to give, you know, like in that old tale, to give the fishing rod instead of a fish. So education and support through education, because veterans can get quality education but not have the opportunity to get employment. And I know many people who dropped from education because they couldn't. And another thing important is that our psychologists receive proper training and schooling abroad and learn from the US psychologists or Israeli psychologists would have to invent the wheel.
Because
you can learn from.
mostly you can learn from the experts abroad. And I believe in this case, Ukraine will be very quickly able to overcome the challenges. Thank you very much. So this is the word that we take away from our today's meeting, systemic approach. So you just name one sphere in Ukraine where systemic approach would harm. I believe you won't find one. Thank you very much, dear speakers, Julia, Theresa. Thank you very much, for conducting of the research. Thank you very much to interpreters who supported us in terms of language. And I would like to thank the veterans for your service and for the peace in Ukraine, and see you next time. All the best.